of this forum is really to provide a venue for all of us who are approaching this problem from different angles to try and share the latest of what we're up to. The purpose for the meeting today was to touch base and hopefully hear from a few folks, but also to share some of the updates from data that we've been collecting as part of the OpenOx project. Before we keep going, just as a reminder, if you can, please list your organizational affiliation and your Zoom name, just so people know who's here and can stimulate a more specific discussion at the end. Don't forget to use mute. We are recording these meetings, so these are public forum meetings, so please don't share anything confidential. Please don't share any PHI. And we will post the summary of the meeting as well as the recording up on the Open Oximetry website on the community page. And if there are others who you think should be here and are not here and maybe don't know about this group, please feel free to ask them to sign up, which can be done on the homepage of the Open Oximetry website. We'll briefly do a quick introduction and recap of some of the recent meetings of this subgroup. Then we'll hear some new data from Dr. Ronald Bisagarawa and team from Uganda, who've been collecting some data there on skin pigment. And then we'll have a few more updates from OpenOx and then some open forum for those who want to share anything, and then also discussion on some of the questions that may come up. So to recap some of what's been going on in these meetings and just in general, I think most of us are well familiar with the main issue that we've been talking about, which is current regulatory frameworks for pulse oximetry generally do not have very clear guidance on how to ensure diversity of skin pigment. This requirement of 2 out of 10 or 15% of the total cohort, which I think jumps out clearly as a very small number, and also the issue of the prevalent use of subjective scales like Fitzpatrick, Massey, Martin, et cetera, also being problematic. There's been several papers published by, again, many on this call, including WIM. These are some of the figures from WIM and Mike Jaffe and Ellis Monk's recent work, talking about some of the problems with the subjective scales in terms of printing the scales and reproducibility, inter-operator variability, potential for operator bias. So if you haven't seen those papers, which have been shared on prior calls, please check those out. And we do have a list of those papers on the website as well. We've also talked quite a bit in this group about the fact that race is a social construct and a biological characteristic and should not really be used at all for ensuring diversity of skin pigment. These are some data that we had shared previously, though updated with more people. Basically trying to show that race is not skin pigment and skin pigment is not race. For any given race, there is a very wide range of skin pigments, and vice versa. For any given skin pigment, there's a wide range of races. Now, of course, depending on the country, depending on how race is reported, there may be trends in pigment, and certainly we have seen some of that, but very imperfect if using or relying on race for ensuring diversity of skin pigment. Now, of course, we're also talking about health disparities. And when talking about health disparities, race is very relevant and important to follow. But the focus of a lot of the discussion in this group really has been specific to skin pigment and the interaction of skin pigment and optical devices like pulse oximeters. And just as a note, I know some of these slides have quite a bit of numbers on them. All of these slides will be posted on the site as soon as the meeting's over, so you'll be able to take your time and browse through these. I'd also invite any comments or questions as we go through, so feel free to raise your hand, and when we come to some stopping points, we can try and chip away at those as we go, or save them for later. So don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have a question or comment or something's not clear on one of the slides. Continuing with the recap, these are data that we had shared previously. These are ITA data collected from the Equiox trial here in San Francisco at our public safety net hospital for the city. And in the population that we see here, this is critically ill adults. And in this population, We were seeing, sorry, Bob, were you going to say something?
Yeah, yeah, I was. Your voice, maybe it's just my receiving end, but it gets real garbled at times. I'm not sure if there's a bandwidth issue.
Is anybody else having that issue with my?
I think it's Bob's end.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Sorry, Bob.
Yes, indeed.
So this, again, was data that we had shared before from our real-world clinical trial, San Francisco Public Safety Net Hospital. Of course, San Francisco is based in the US. It is in a predominantly lightly pigmented population, relatively speaking. Nonetheless, in our population of folks who were characterized as having dark skin pigment in the group, based on Monk scale HI or J, half of them also had an ITA value of less than -50, which is quite a bit darker than the current cutoff of -30 for characterizing dark. And so this is something that we'll come back with. We see a similar distribution in our lab cohort, which we recruit from around the city as well. We've also shared these data previously. These are, about 30 devices, pulse oximeters that we've been testing as part of the OpenOx project. What you can see here for each device is represented by a cluster of 4 bars. Each of the bars is light, medium, dark, and very dark ITA, using the cutoffs listed over here on the right. So essentially, we added a very dark category at less than -50 to try and see if, for pulse oximeters, is this -50 group, are we seeing a difference in performance? And the short answer is, on all of this data, it's very mixed. Some of the devices have, no appreciable bias that we're able to link to skin pigment. Others do have bias linked to pigment. Sometimes that bias is positive, sometimes it's negative. Sometimes the very dark group is where we are seeing it most dramatically, but the data are mixed. But I know this is a question we have gotten, and so I just wanted to highlight this slide again. Sandy, I see your hand.
Yeah, you speak of clinically significant differences. Is that 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%?
Sorry, statistically significant, not necessarily clinically significant.
And that's part of the challenge, right?
It's a big part of the challenge, yes. Thanks for that comment. So anyways, just making the point that, how best to ensure diversity is one thing, but it is relevant for the issue of pulse oximetry, making sure that we're accounting for groups where we are seeing differences in performance in the devices. All of these data are on the OpenOx website if you want to dig into it.
And sorry for interrupting,
yeah,
can I just hammer home that there are some devices that perform really well across the different pigmentation groups, and some that there's a big disparate response, right? And
that is correct. Fifi, can you advance a couple slides, like 2 or 3 clicks, just so you can zoom in on a couple of these? One more, thank you. Just so you can, these are just a few examples of if you were to zoom in on what the device on the left, pretty good performance, no statistically significant differences in the groups. In the middle, and that red line is zero bias. In the red line, we're seeing relatively more negative bias in the dark skin pigment, but positive in all. And then in the right-hand column, we're seeing a device with kind of not great performance across the skin groups, but we're also seeing that it's the opposite trend in terms of the effective, the correlation with pigment as we're describing it. Kumu, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm always a little nervous about binning ITA. Did you model this by varying the cutoffs, let's say to -30, 40?
Yeah, and I'll show you in a couple slides what that effect has been.
Thank you.
It may not completely satisfy where you're going with that, but I think it may somewhat. Next slide. So I think everybody is very well familiar with this. We've talked about existing bins for ITA, which are shown here, largely derived from data in the 90s, and then 2006, 2013, added quite a bit more data on more diverse populations. And appreciate that Dr. Delbino has also joined us today so that we can have some discussion around this. But some of the discussion up until now has highlighted the fact that there are, relatively more and relatively narrower bins for well characterizing light skin pigment, in part perhaps because of the origin of how these were derived, and relatively fewer and relatively wider bins to characterize dark skin pigment. Next slide. So based on all that data, just kind of rounding out the recap here, where we went with all of this was, the range for dark skin pigment can be quite wide. We saw some signals that we may only be able to tease out a significantly different effect for pulse oximeter performance in ITA less than -50. I would caution that that is not robust data, but we were seeing for a small number of devices seeing that. We also were trying to account for the fact that how there's a lot of operator bias in the implementation of the subjective scales, and that left there to be too much chance. And then also we were seeing -50 as a real population that was common even in a predominantly lightly pigmented population like San Francisco. So with that, we kind of went to the conclusion that rather than having 2 out of 10 or 20 or 15%, it probably should be closer to a third dark. And also that dark should not just rely on the -30 cutoff, but also incorporate some significant proportion of those who are characterized as dark with an ITA of less than -50. And Josh, I see the ITA measurement question. You're asking where are we making these measurements? Most of the data that we're talking about are forehead. And in our population, forehead correlated relatively well with the dorsal distal finger just above the nail bed. We do have data for other sites, and we will be releasing that. So you're welcome to do other analyses on that. And if you have specific questions, feel free to send them our way and we can try and run those analyses too and share them back. But for most of the data, we're talking about forehead. Next slide, please. So with all that, a lot of the questions that came up were, what colorimeters could be used? Which metrics should we be using? Which cutoffs should we be using if we're using ITA? Which sites should we be measuring at? Are there additional data that are needed? And so we've been trying to chip away at several of these questions, and we'll try and share some of that data over the next 25 minutes or so, and then have some discussion. Sorry, I see a question. What does HIJ? So when we're saying HIJ, we're referring to the Monk skin tone scale categories of A through J, where A is lightly pigmented and J is darkly pigmented. The cutoff that we've been using for binning into 3 bins of light, medium, dark have been HIJ for the dark pigmented population. Thanks for the question. We're doing a study right now, and I'll ask Ella Benke and Lily Ortiz to maybe share some updates with this. Many have provided input on this study, so we'll share some updates on where we are. Ella and Lily, do you want to share a few updates here?
Yeah, so we can talk about just how you all know that there's devices out there that can measure skin pigment, but they do vary greatly in terms of cost, the technologies they use, and then overall their general performance. So to better understand some of these differences, our team is evaluating these 5 devices that you see here on the screen. So the X-Ray RM200QC, the AM510, the WR10QC, and the ColorMeter Pro. To the relatively well-validated Konica Minolta CM700D for our reference. Like Mike mentioned, some of these were chosen off of your recommendations, and then also because they were across a wide range of price points. The lowest costing device was $120, and the highest cost of the lower cost devices was around $2,000. So we took triplicate measurements at 2 different sites. We chose the forehead to act as our sun exposed site. And then we also did the inner upper arm to act as the sun unexposed site. And we also figured these would be the best for ensuring that the devices would make full contact with the skin. So we did measure 3 times to ensure consistency, and then we also calibrated the devices to the manufacturer's recommendations, and also data collection was conducted under the same conditions, lighting, etc. And our main objective, Phoebe, you can stay on the other side. Thanks. Okay. We had 3 main objectives for our study. So the first was to evaluate inter-operator reliability. So we had Ella, myself, and Brandon measure on the Pantone scale 3 times across a select range of Pantone skin tones. So this would help us determine that objective. And then we also wanted to assess repeatability, so identify how reliable these devices were at producing consistent results. And we did this both with the triplicate measurements on skin and on the Pantone scale. And our last objective was to compare the performance of devices overall and see who was producing or which device was producing the closest values to the Konica Minolta. So we would like to share some of that data with you, but we're still running our analyses. However, the prelim findings are showing that the X-Rite device, so the higher costing device of the lower cost devices, is producing values closest to the Konica Minolta, both in terms of LEB values and overall ITA at both the forehead and the inner arm. The AM-T510, which is one of the lower costing devices, and also the Color Reader Pro are showing comparable results, but just a slightly larger range of differences in values. And the Color Meter Pro and the WR10QC were producing very variable results from the Konica Minolta. So yeah, this is just giving us some insight that maybe these lower cost devices can offer reliable, cost-effective alternatives for skin pigment measurement, but there's still a ton of work to be done. And we'll share more with that when it's all done. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Lloyd. Thanks for the updates on that. Next slide. So now we'll share a little bit of data from preliminary analysis from our cohorts from both the lab and the real-world clinical setting. We have an ICU cohort, that's the OpenOx study. There's about 637 people in that. And then we have a lab cohort, which has 152 individuals where we've taken measurements. This is sort of a breakdown of gender, race, and some of the which scales they were assessed with. Next slide. And the next slide, it's a bit clearer what we did in each. So here you can see these were what Lily just referred to with all those devices we're only doing in the lab cohort and in a subset of the lab cohort. So I don't show those data here. But these are data where we are doing lots of measurements in the ICU cohort and the lab cohort. So we have the Konica Minolta, the Delphin Skin Color Catch, von Luschen scale, Monk scale, and a perceived Fitzpatrick scale. The numbers here represent the number of measurements. So, for some of the individuals, we were measuring at 9 sites per person. And so that's why these, or more. And so that's why these numbers are much higher, but you can see kind of where we were collecting data across these 9 potential sites. Next slide. We're doing a little bit of comparisons using the either published values or measured values for the different scales to try and compare things like luminosity. How wide is the range of luminosity between von Luschen, Fitzpatrick, and Monk, for example? Is it reaching the far ends of luminosity? Is there kind of an equal distribution or even distribution to try and characterize the range of luminosity that might be there? And you can see that, for von Luschen, it does not really reach the dark end. Fitzpatrick does not really characterize the dark end of the luminosity very much, and there's gaps. On the right-hand side, same thing with ITA, just showing that slightly differently. Next slide. We're also looking at perceptibility thresholds, again, using either published or measured values. Some of this data has been published by others on the call, so we're trying to contribute some to that as well. Again, the idea here is that ideally the subjective scales would have color categories that the human eye could easily discern between for the purposes of characterizing. Scales like von Luschen or even Pantone, where there are so many scales or so many colors where adjacent colors are very hard to discern. In other words, falling below this discernibility threshold of 2 that we set here for delta E. Von Luschen has many that are very hard to discern. Fitzpatrick and Monk have fewer categories, and so somewhat inherently have less of a problem there. But nonetheless, some of those colors are difficult to discern. Okay, next slide. In this heat map, we're basically just trying to show that when you're assigning using perceived Fitzpatrick scale and Monk, again, these are forehead values that we're comparing. And we're trying to ask the question essentially like, if we assign light with one scale, is the person categorized as light by the other scale? And unsurprisingly, we're seeing that that's not always the case. Notably, if you look at the darkest Fitzpatrick, the darkest Fitzpatrick are mostly H by Monk. So that's 79 in green. H is at the lightest end of the dark options, interestingly, and almost none of the perceived Fitzpatrick fives are categorized by Monk scale as dark at all. So this is just highlighting one of the many limitations of relying on the subjective scales alone for ensuring diversity of skin pigment. Next slide. Here's for our San Francisco cohorts, combined cohorts, we're showing the ITA median values and ranges for each of the perceived Fitzpatrick categories, as well as for each of the Monk categories. Just to highlight here, if you focus in on the Monk categories and we look towards HIJ, and our cohort with our team assigning scales, and with our printed version of the scales, and I don't have our thresholds to share in a slide, but I can share those, the measured thresholds for our printed scales. But here you can see that our HIJ, our dark pigment category, starts quite a bit darker than -30 and extends and has kind of 3 categories there that are not really adequately characterized necessarily by the -30. And we're going to see a little bit more data on this coming up. Next slide, please. So Kumu, this may answer some of your question. So here we were taking our combined population for our cohort, so about 1,000 people, 900 people, and we were assigning everyone to be either light, medium, dark, based on Fitzpatrick in the top, Monk scale in the middle, ITA using existing bins at the bottom. And what you see is with using the Fitzpatrick in particular, we get about 25% of the population characterized as being darkly pigmented. But with Monk or ITA, that number is closer to like 15%. So quite a bit different. Okay, sorry, one click forward, please. If we change our ITA thresholds, though, to account for some additional options for characterizing those with ITA less than -30. So in this case, we added a bin for less than -50. When we do that, the percent of the population that would be characterized as very dark drops considerably. Next slide, please. I'll show this in a slightly different way. So here with Fitzpatrick, the percent of the population is again closer to 25%. With Monk and with ITA less than -30, the bins are between 10 and 15%. If we add this ITA less than -50, that group in particular is quite underrepresented or minimally represented in this at closer to like 5%. Next slide, please. One point to reiterate is that we're not accounting for operator bias in this at all, which is significant when using the subjective scales. So with Fitzpatrick, the numbers I just showed you, they may be 25% when we're doing it. They may be very different when another team is doing this. Same thing with Monk. Depending on the operator, the percent who are characterized, percent of the population is characterized as having dark skin pigment can be different. We're seeing far less variability in those characterizations when we're using the objective measures, unsurprisingly and consistent with prior data generally. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ronald Bisagarawa in the next slide. And the next 10, 15 minutes or so, Dr. Bisagarawa is going to go through some of the data that they're collecting with the team in Uganda. Ronald, over to you. Not sure if maybe we have lost Ronald here. 1 second. Dr. Bisagarawa was en route from India back to Uganda overnight, and so it's possible there were some delays there. I see Dr. Balamba on. Oh, are you there, Ronald?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Okay, go ahead. Over to you.
All right. My name is Ronald Bisegera, an anesthesiologist and researcher with UCSF CHESA and Association of Anesthesiologists of Uganda. We conducting a study that is characterizing skin pigment in Africa to ensure representation in medical device research and development. We have a couple of collaborators on this project, including Professor Mike Lipnick and many others from different fields, dermatologists, to look at the skin pigment characterization, looking at the best devices and maybe the more appropriate devices for the different functions. Next slide. So the work that we are doing is supported by UCSF CHESA and Lifebox funding. Next slide. So we've got ethical approval from different regulatory bodies, UCSF. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So in this study, we are looking at characterization of skin color in an African population. Using no subjective scale. We're also using 4 objective methods, which we shall see shortly, and some have already been highlighted in the data presented by Mike. Next slide. So the goal is to see that we improve the understanding of methods to evaluate skin color, especially in our population, in an African population. So we want to ensure that there is better diversity of skin color for medical device development and validation. Next slide. So we are doing a prospective cross-sectional study, and we are recruiting any volunteers of age 18 and above, with no visible dermatologic conditions affecting their skin color or tattoos or makeup at the measurement sites. And we are excluding those with visible dermatologic conditions, tattoos, and makeup at the different measurement sites. Next slide. So this is how the measurements are being made. This was using the Konica, taking the measurements, and also how we're using the Monk skin tone scale. Next slide. So these are the 4 devices that are being used for evaluating the objective methods. That's the Colorida Pro, and then the X-Rite, then the color meter, and then we also have the Konica. These are the 4 that we are using in this study. Next slide, please. So update on so far with the demographics. Our mean age has been 27.2, and the range is from 18 to 70. 57.4% are male. So far, the countries that we've been able to recruit up to date, we have had participants from Uganda, where the study is being conducted, participants of whose country of birth was Sudan, and then South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, DRC, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, and Chad. That's a representation of the different countries. And we try to put this together in 2 different African regions. Predominantly, the East African region represented at 87.3%, North Africa at 9%, Central Africa at 2.9%, West Africa 0.8%, and South Africa not yet recruited people from those South African countries. But we are in the process of also getting them on board to screen them, assess them using these devices. Next slide, please. So these are the number of participants per MOOC category. We notice that we don't have any in the category A for the MOOC score. Also none from category C. These are all measurements from the forehead, just for clarity, measurements from the forehead. We have majority lying within H at 35%, and actually like more than 50% are falling in the HIJ for the forehead. Next slide. So another majority are dark-skinned. And for this slide, we have banana curves from the forehead and also all measurements. From the forehead banana curve, it tells us that nearly the entire study population so far are being categorized by only 2 bins. That's 10 and then less than 30. That's where they are falling. When we look at also at all the sites combined, and that's the other graph, it tells us that nearly all the study participants are in 3, maybe maximum 2, but majority are in only 3 categories or bins based on the ITA measurements. Next slide. So here is a comparison between the Uganda population, or the population in the Uganda study, and also the one in comparison to that from San Francisco. So we noticed that there is the ITAs for Uganda, majority are, the ITAs are darker in comparison to the ones in San Francisco. When you look at D in the Uganda study, the mean ITA was at -19, whereas in San Francisco we have 41. For E we have -24, and then the other is 33. So the ITAs in Uganda are darker than the ones that are in San Francisco when you compare per category of the MOOC score. This suggests a bias, or maybe operator bias, like someone from who is used to dark-skinned population in a predominantly dark-skinned population is more likely to not recognize people who are to categorization. They're not likely to categorize them as dark as someone who is used to people with light-skinned population. And that could be the explanation for this discrepancy between the ITAs in Uganda and the ITAs in San Francisco. Next slide. So in conclusion, for now, based on the preliminary findings of this study, we found that the MOOC scale was relatively easier to use than the Pantone skin scale. And all calorimeters were generally easy to use. The objective methods, they were much easier to use than the Pantone in comparison to the MOOC. And ITA ranges for MOOC categories had relatively darker ITAs than in the US cohort, probably from operator bias, which you talked about. And nearly the entire study population was described by only 2 ITA categories at the forehead. More ITA categories are needed to describe people with dark skin based on that banana curve that we showed. Thank you for listening. Open to questions or suggestions. We're continuing to recruit participants so that we have representation from each of the African regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald, very much. Any questions from the group for Ronald?
Could you just recap? Sorry for interrupting. Could you just recap why you think you need more ITA ranges?
Let's go to that slide, the banana curve, that has the banana curve, please. Yes. When you look at the distribution of the measurements, ITA measurements, we have majority, for example, forehead, majority, nearly all are categorized by only 2. And yet, when you compare, they will show us the one for San Francisco, where there are more, there is more representation from each of their, they are more subdivided. The lighter populations are more, maybe are better characterized, or smaller subdivisions compared to only 2 for the darker skin. That's why we're proposing that if we have more more categories on the dark skin.
Well, don't we also need the piece about how much bias comes in those different categories? Because
These were from, I'm not sure what bias you're referring to, but these were ITA measurements, which are less likely to be from operator bias, since it's an objective method.
Ronald,
Right,
do
I'm
Not sure what bias you're referring to.
I think
Beg
you're
your
referring
pardon?
to, do you mind if I chime in?
Yes, please.
Sandy, I think you're referring to like, well, where do the pulse oximeters have bias?
yeah.
Yeah, so, and I think that's what Kumo's point is as well. I think they're two distinct things here. So that's a real question where, and that has to do with how we're defining dark. But there's another question, which is, these categories are trying to characterize the range of human skin pigment into different bins. I think we agree on that.
Yeah.
The origin was, and if that's the case, why do we really well characterize people with light pigment, but then group everybody with dark pigment into 2 very broad categories, right? So that's one question. And that has nothing to do with pulse oximeter bias. And so I think that's what Ronald is speaking to.
Yeah. But
we don't have enough to characterize the spectrum of skin pigment.
I mean, the first pass was just the brute force, 40 degrees this category, 40 degrees in that category, 40 degrees in this category, right? It was just a linear parsing of the zones.
No.
And really
that's
to do this.
That's not the origin though, Sandy. Right. So this may help with this conversation. This is really like key. So we can just jump to the discussion here, which I think would be great. Can you go to the next slide, please? Keep going. There you go. So on this one, so here what you're looking at are data from the San Francisco cohort in the top row, data from the Uganda cohort in the bottom row. And we use different cutoffs to describe it. The current cutoffs are the first column, which are derived from Chardon and Dr. Delbino, which really well characterize the lightly pigmented proportion of our population. Incidentally, very light is an extremely rare category. That's the only category that we like, even in a predominantly lightly pigmented population, had very few. But well characterized the light pigmented population, but not the rest of the population. In the Uganda data, there's there are 2 categories to describe everybody.
Yeah, I got you. The whole thing needs to be rotated down 45 degrees.
Well, potentially, that's one way to look at it. And so if we geometrically just rotate, if we rotate it and geometrically make them evenly spaced, that's kind of the second column. And we end up with cutoffs that are not like hugely different, but it does add, 3 bins to categorize people with lighter pigment, 3 categories to characterize darker pigment. And we have this very dark pigment category that now is better represented. Again, pulse ox bias aside.
Yep.
Then if we go to the next column here, we looked at our populations and said, well, what if we just say, with the population we've recruited in San Francisco or Uganda, what if we break it up into, 20% per bin, for example, what would the bins look like, or an even distribution by population? And unsurprisingly, this is kind of what it looks like. The top looks very similar to the originally proposed bins that we are using from Chardon and Dr. Albino. But if we were to have more representation of darker pigments and to do a similar thing, we would have quite different categories. But there are limitations in that, not the least of which is our San Francisco and Uganda cohorts are not just like an equal distribution of global populations of pigment. So doing this is very artificial. Also, side note, the goal for recruitment in Uganda is to have relatively equal representation from around the continent. And we also, our colleagues in South Asia are collecting similar data set, similar methods in South Asia. So we hope to have those data. But anyways, this equal proportions thing is quite limited by who's in the cohort. If we look to the right and we break this up a different way, where we say, okay, what's the visual perception of using the monk scale? What was the visual perception of different categories of people that we're seeing? We group monk A and B together, monk C and D together, monk E and F, et cetera. And we make these 5 categories. That's what it looks like in San Francisco. But in Uganda, it looks very different. Binning by Fitzpatrick, I believe, and Dr. Delvino can correct me, was some of the original way that, the far left column, original scales were derived, was, mapping to a subjective scale and characterizing skin pigment based on perception. As we've discussed, there are limitations in that. And so I think what we're showing here, none of these is really perfect or adequately captures where we're going. And at least from some of the discussions that we've had in our team, one of the ways that we've been looking at this is kind of until we have more data, a bit of a compromise. It's clear that to characterize skin pigment, we need more categories to characterize dark pigments. And so adding additional divisions so that, basically adding 2 lines through dark and brown, but preserving potentially the existing bins for the existing Delvino bins so that data are comparable and that, the basis of those data, which have more to them than just Fitzpatrick correlation, still are preserved. So we still have comparability with older data, but we add 2 new categories. Now that doesn't address your issue of, well, where's the bias for skin pigment in pulse oximetry? This is just, how do we have a scale that we can all use that better characterizes human skin pigment? Then we need to do more of the work of, well, which of these categories do we need to make sure is represented in the cohorts for the validation studies?
And of course, the obvious questions we can use ITA as a continuous measurement as well.
We can. So maybe I'll pause there. I think there were several comments here. If anybody, so Josh, your question, have we considered using a uniformly distributed ITA stratification? Yes, that second box there we've considered, and we would love more comments here. I think the biggest downside to that is that we lose some of the comparability with older data, of which there is quite a bit, but the advantage is that it, as you say here, I don't know if Josh, you want to come off mute and add more there?
Sure. Thank you very much. This is great data to share. We've also been seeing something similar here and trying to figure out which stratification system to use. And yeah, I do understand your point in, hey, let's consider what has been done before us, but like we may need to just reevaluate the whole thing here now and sort of identify something that's uniform and that can be sort of standardized no matter what population you're sort of looking at, which is shown in the data on the right-hand side. We consider using like 25% cutoffs, which may reduce things a bit more. And similarly, we didn't see much in sort of the very light part. So this definitely looks very similar to some data that we've been acquiring on our team as well. This looks really good. Something else to potentially consider, I know this is kind of going against what's already been out there and established by dermatologists, is the reddish hue isn't captured in the LB. We throw away that A data, but how can one do that in a digestible fashion so that it's easy for everyone to interpret?
Josh, thanks for the comment. Agree. I think they're good points. Does anybody want to, Ellis, I see your hand. Does anybody want to respond to Josh?
Well, if I can, I agree. The ITA is obviously an L versus B plane. And it's that work from Delbino in 2013 that demonstrated, a relationship between melanin content and ITA, right? And I think that's in all of these scenarios, ITA is merely a surrogate that is trying to estimate melanin content. But there are papers that demonstrate that, if you put a blood pressure cuff on somebody and you measure ITA at the forearm before the cuff is on and after the cuff is on, even though their melanin didn't change, the ITA changes. So there is some component of ITA not being kind of an imperfect surrogate for melanin. And if one were to come up with a better surrogate for melanin, that would be awesome. There are, melanin index is something that is, captured by Konica Minolta and by others in the Fullerton paper that was kind of discussed in the chat. They define melanin index as kind of like a log of 1 over intensity of 630 nanometers or 1 over red. In the paper that the FDA group put forward on a summary of colorimeters, the melanin index is like from Steve Jacques' paper about, NIR versus R. And so there are so many different approaches one could take. I think like at the end of the day, and as Wim just said, we can search for perfection. I think I agree with him. Like there is a very interesting research question. How can we better non-invasively characterize skin constituents? And that's like a research question. But a lot of the discussion here was centered around the fact that if our goal is to include people with a very diverse range of pigmentation in clinical trials intended to validate devices, it would be a mistake to pick a cutoff that gives us a false impression that our study population is diversely pigmented and includes sufficiently darkly pigmented people, when in reality that cutoff is fairly weak. And so as Ellis pointed out in the chat, when you look at the Uganda data and you look at -30, it makes you say, is -30 really dark enough as a cutoff for us to use? Because if we use it and we say, yeah, we have diversely pigmented people in our studies, but we pick a cutoff that's not that dark, we fool ourselves. And then the studies come out, they're all validated, and then there's a whole group of people in which it hasn't actually been validated. So I'm all for the research question, but I also kind of, my only pushback would be, I'm not sure that ITA is so fundamentally flawed that it won't help us in our desire to ensure that we enroll a diverse population. The question just comes down to what cutoff should we pick that ensures that we don't falsely conclude that the population is diverse when in reality it isn't.
Thanks, Leo. And Ellis, over to you. And I think Wim also made a really good point here, which is that we should not let perfect be the enemy of good here. The bar is currently on the floor for ensuring diversity of skin pigment. And if we could talk about this for 5 years to come, but we could also make significant progress very quickly here. And so we're trying to balance that as we all get more data. Ellis, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, speaking to that precisely, as I put in the chat, I think it's pretty clear that -30 is insufficient to ensure that we have darkly pigmented study subjects. So I'm kind of wondering, and this goes back to Mike and Leo and others and Vim, we've had this discussion before, if for the purposes of the standard, we want to put in that extra addendum to the -30 bin where we say at least 50% need to be -50 or more. And if we think that returning to that idea, is sufficient enough to solve this problem, just practically speaking, without throwing all the ITA bins totally away, but rather just adding that extra addendum about -50, and maybe even increasing the proportion of people that are in the dark bin so that we increase the probability of having more diversity there. So I'm wondering what people's thoughts are about that.
And just to be clear, when you say -50 or more, you mean -60, -70, which is, I guess, less, but whatever.
So the threshold would be, so currently, as I understand it, the threshold for dark is -30, right? But what I'm talking about is something we've all talked about before, at least many of us on this call have, which is to add the other recommendation, which is -50. That cutoff needs to be at least 50% of that dark bin so that we make sure that we catch some of the people that would be considered to be very dark by current standards.
Yep.
Thanks, Ellis. Any comments for Ellis's comment? Keith, I see your hand.
Thanks, Michael. I was thinking about this discussion as relates to requirements and how manufacturers recruit volunteers for verification studies. I can see a situation where even as we are aware of what's currently expected and what's going to be changing in the future, there could be some provision for updating verification results to reflect what we learn as we go down this path. Because clearly we know more now than we did, 8 months ago. And I guarantee in another year, we'll have even more insights as we get more data from Uganda and from some of the other South Asian partners as well. So to your point, bias towards action, we should all keep that in mind. Don't be perfect, be good, and and continue to look at ways to continuously update the data that we collect for the design of our devices.
Thanks, Keith. Kumu, I see your comment in the chat. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, thank you. So it just gets to, I think for the purposes of this conversation, like we're looking at ITA, I think it's been expressed before during this meeting, we're looking at ITA as a predictor of pulse oximeter performance, not just to necessarily stop at binning it with respect to melanin content or what we would consider as light, medium, and dark. But we have the specific aim of seeing how it predicts pulse oximeter performance. And I don't think we know that yet. And so I'm for looking at it continuously. And I just wanted to also point out, most of us think about a fingertip pulse oximeter and, we don't consider other areas that sensor application can be placed. At the FDA, we get a lot of reviews of pulse oximeters that are placed on the chest, on the inner arm, in different spots. So these ITA cutoffs and the pulse oximeter performance will look different in these areas if you use the same cutoff. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumu. Would love other comments to that. I don't see other hands, so I'll respond while others form other thoughts. I guess, again, I think there are 2 different issues here. One is how can the ITA bins be improved to better represent the world's populations, especially for people with darker skin pigment? And then the second is, where do we see bias in pulse oximeters related to skin pigment? The second question is going to be harder to answer. And I think waiting to get the perfect answer to that is a mistake. And that there's no reason we can't improve the binning today while also trying to answer question number 2. I think for the regulatory colleagues who are here, the second question is the most specific and of interest. But I also think, to Wim's point, how do we avoid letting perfect be the enemy of good? To answer your second question also, or this second issue, we're seeing such variable performance in devices, it's almost inevitable that any cutoff we choose, if we're making a cutoff based on oximeter performance, an oximeter that's created in, let's say we choose it's -50, that may change. We don't know in terms of which devices actually have bias at -50 or -30 or -70. So almost no matter what, even if we used the data we have today to make the bins, which as best we can tell, -50 is actually quite reasonable, and we can try to more robustly show the analysis, Kumu, that you were asking about. We just don't have enough devices that have that same bias trend to help us see it. But I think it's a great point, and we can certainly do that. But I'm just not sure that, so to play the extreme here, let's say that we only see pulse oximeter bias at ITA less than -80. Would we propose that the only change to the current ITA bins be add a -80? I don't think so. Rather, we could make an incremental, very significant improvement to the existing bins by adding 2 additional categories to describe dark pigmentation. And then if we get more data to suggest that we indeed need to add even more delineations, then we can always do that in the future. But right now we're like several years into this problem, and I do think that there is a solution. You know, there is, right now the bar is on the floor. Let's get it off the floor and then try and get it to the perfect height. And I just worry that if we continue to wait for, and you know, it's on our team. We've been trying to collect these data as best we can to try and characterize the oximeter bias, and it's just been really hard to show. It's not, you know, we're not seeing it in the way that we thought we would see it in terms of consistent trends affecting more devices, et cetera. But if we continue to wait on that, I do think we run the risk of having problems. Additionally, we're talking about pulse oximetry, but this is very relevant to other, you know, these bins are very relevant to ensuring diversity of skin pigment for other types of studies. And if we were to make them based on the use case for pulse oximetry, while exceptionally relevant to this group, it may have 0 relevance to any other groups. And so I just caution with putting all of our weight on what is likely to be data we may never really have, and run the risk of delaying even further, you know, ensuring diversity. So, you know, what is an interim solution that we could all be comfortable with, maybe is a different way to phrase it while we get the other data.
Mike, I can't see if any whose hands are raised. So if I can say something just to echo what you just said, but if I need to wait, I'm happy to wait.
Go for it. Keep it brief if you can,
Okay.
just 'cause we're up on the hour and we do want to respect.
Yeah, I think like I think Kumu's point is a really good one, but I really wholeheartedly agree with your feedback on it, because yes, ITA or the degree of pigmentation varies site to site. I think the goal here from the regulatory perspective should be, what is a reasonable estimate of what it means to be darkly pigmented, right? So if we enroll people in studies and we want to make sure that we are representative and all people are represented in these studies, if we have an incorrect assessment in our minds of what darkly pigmented means, we can falsely assume or conclude that we have sufficient diversity in our study, when in reality we don't. And so that, from that perspective, knowing that the range of ITA really does extend down to this -80, and that there are plenty of people in the world with that pigmentation range for at least sun-exposed sites, it makes sense that we should, whether we use a particular bin or not, we should at least try to include up to that extreme value. Now, on other sites like earlobe, nose, or you know, the palm, other sites, that site may have a different range globally in terms of the maximum and minimum ITA. And it would make sense to have bins or guidelines around that particular range. But keeping in mind those extremes, I think, makes a lot of sense. Just from the perspective of, let's make sure we include those people, test the devices in people with that range of pigmentation. We may find that there is a tipping point, an ITA above which the bias really explodes. That's all kind of stuff that could be determined later by researchers. But from the regulatory perspective, just thinking about the maximum values, and that's why, you know, I agree, like Ellison and I are on the same page here, not anchoring around -30 and ensuring that we include darker, because the world population is darker.
Thanks, Leo. We will wrap up here briefly. Kumu, I saw you come off of mute. Do you want to have the final word here?
Yeah, I think for enrollment, so I think the differences in the ask is the differences between current FDA thinking and perhaps the ISO standards. I believe ITA is used for enrollment purposes, if I'm correct. Whereas if you remember from the discussion paper, we enrolled by MST and then figure out what the IT at the sensor, the emitter surface of the sensor site would be. So we're not using ITA for enrollment purposes. So the question would be that ITA, what is the need to even bin for purposes of analysis of pulse oximeter performance for SpO2 bias differences? Why bin the ITA cohorts? That's the only part. I don't want to, take up more of this discussion. I think it is important discussion, but I know we're limited and you have other items on the agenda.
Kumu, thanks. I think that's a great point. Very brief response is yes, and Jean, I see your comment. Yes, for enrollment. I think there's also a role in communication of, light, medium, dark. When we're talking about differential bias on a continuous scale, that's a kind of a hard concept to understand to a certain degree. But the other point is, we have 30 devices where we've done cohorts of at least 24, if not 50 or 100 people in, and the differential bias metric is not necessarily raising the bar. We're catching all the poor performers with ARMS still. We're not failing a lot of new devices because of the differential bias, but we do see bias, and sometimes we only see that bias in the darkest cohorts. And so for us, that continues to sound this alarm of we're not sure that the continuous is the way to go, and we don't know what the way to go is, but this conversation is going to continue to be very relevant probably for quite a while to come. I know we're up on time. I think we could probably all talk about this for quite a while. I hope that we can convene this group again sometime soon and that people will reach out and continue to share. We'll send a summary, including some of the papers that have been shared in the chat, the recording of this meeting, and then we are releasing new data on the website continuously about the oximeter performance, and we hope to preprint a publication this month, both with our skin pigment data, as well as some of the data for the devices, including some of the relevant answers to the relevant questions around where are we seeing the bias in the oximeters, but lots still to answer. Wish we had more answers at this point. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for the discussion, and look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks
See you
very
next time.
much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed.